Hi, everyone. I hope you're excited about seeing this additional episode in your feed this week. As you likely already know, on this weekly podcast, A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases. But when I was about 20 episodes in, I decided to do a special episode that featured 2 cases solved with DNA and persistent detective work, decades after the crimes had occurred. I wanted listeners to see that there is purpose in creating conversation around these cases, even when justice still seems out of reach. One such case was the 1996 case of Jasmine Porter in the Bronx. Jasmine had been murdered in front of her young son in the middle of the night in her apartment on Davidson Avenue. The case went unsolved for over 2 decades and then got an unexpected lead that landed in the hands of NYPD Bronx homicide detective Robert Klein. He took it from there, and in the end, a violent offender was taken off the streets, with Detective Klein being the one to bring him in. I walked through the case on this podcast, and since that time, I have released 74 weekly episodes. So you can imagine my surprise when all of a sudden, recently, I heard from Detective Klein himself. He said, hey, I was the lead detective on that case. And he said he appreciated the way I shared the story on the podcast. Not only that, he offered to jump on the podcast if I ever wanted him to, which was an immediate yes. With my ideas flowing, I messaged him and told him my top 3 ideas to see which one he was most interested in connecting with me for. And his response was, we can do all 3. So if you like this episode, be sure to comment, share, leave comments on the podcast platforms, on social media, hit follow or subscribe because you won't want to miss the future episodes we're doing. As we got talking, we realized we grew up outside of the same city but on opposite sides. Our dads both worked for the same company, and his retirement gig has some overlap with my day job. This world really is that 6 degrees of separation. This episode is going to introduce you to Detective Klein and the work he has done throughout his career. And it's been an impressive one. After his service to our country in the military, he joined the NYPD. He fast-tracked to becoming a detective, and his work spoke for itself. He covered many active and cold homicide cases, and he was promoted to the rank of first-grade NYPD detective, the highest rank. And just to give you a sense of that accomplishment, there are only about 330 total on the entire job of over 30,000 plus. He is well known for finding creative ways to approach cases and for his interrogation skills. He was part of the NYPD FBI Cold Case Task Force. But before I ever spoke a word to Detective Klein, one of the things that stood out to me about him after covering Jasmine Porter's case was how her family spoke of him. Jasmine's family would say in interviews that he worked her case as if it were his own sister and how forever grateful they were to him. So many of the families I talked to for this podcast have lost trust or faith in the detectives working their loved ones' cases, not sure if the police are even still in their corner. So for them to speak of him this way, I don't know how you can measure success much better than that. If you recognize his face from pictures I share on Instagram for this episode, it may be because you saw him on Netflix in the documentary series Conversations with a Killer, the Son of Sam tapes. And that docuseries was released last summer. It stayed on the top 10 Netflix charts for weeks. So if you haven't checked it out, make sure you add it to your list. I also asked if he'd be cool with me asking the millions of questions that run through my head about detective work as I've covered these cases. And not only did he answer mine, but some from listeners like you and my fellow podcaster friends. So with all of that said, let's get into it. I wanted to start by rewinding and figuring out how he got on the path he did. How did he get into police work? Was it always a dream of his? and how, as a Western New Yorker like me, did he end up in New York City?
So the origin story, I guess, right? From the time I was a little kid, I wanted to be the police. It was never like astronaut or baseball player. It was always the police. And I don't have any family that was in the police department. I wasn't close to anyone that was in the police department. For some reason, it captivated me as a kid. And like even going back to like my old yearbook, 6th grade, 7th grade, it was always like, I'm going to be a police. Actually, in 8th grade, I wrote an essay. The opening sentence or group of sentences in that essay was, my life is going to fit me perfect. I will be a New York City detective. I will live on Long Island. I will never be married or have children because I'll always want motorcycles and boats and all this stuff. I made it to New York City. I don't live in Long Island, and I'm on my second marriage, so that didn't ring true. But it was always that. I ended up joining the military right out of high school. Literally a month after I graduated, I was shipped off to boot camp where I was a military police. And that there's really not too many ways you can become the police at 18. But in the military, I was. I was literally driving a patrol car and arresting soldiers for doing soldierly things. That also got me specialized training. I became a canine handler in the Army. They sent me to accident investigation school where I learned how to reconstruct accidents and look at that type of evidence through, equations and all the stuff that accidents leave behind. I ended up, and I started my military service in South Korea. I ended up at West Point after that for 4 years, and then I went back to Korea. During that time frame at West Point, I was a full-time college student, not as a cadet, but West Point offered some great educational opportunities where all the West Point professors would moonlight for local colleges. So I started and finished my undergraduate degree at West Point. And when I went back to Korea, and I stopped off at canine school, went back to Korea, I knew it was the end of my time. At that point, I'd been away from my young daughter for a year and a half, and I knew that I kind of wanted to settle a little bit and start my law enforcement career. I obviously didn't have to make the college stop because I knocked that out while I was active duty. I had taken the test in '99 when I was thinking about getting out the first time. And when I actually got out of the military in '04, I called the NYPD and said, hey, I took the test 5 years ago and I'm out now. And they're like, come on down. My class was huge. It was a 2,000 person class. Somehow or another, I graduated number 1 in that class. Didn't do much for me, except they gave me choice of where I would be assigned, my first assignment. I chose the 44th precinct in the South Bronx, which is the stadium that's right next to, it's the precinct right next to Yankee Stadium. I chose it because of the Yankee Stadium, and it was very close to court. And I remember someone telling me along the line that, you want your ride to court or to Central Booking to be as short as possible, so be somewhere near there. And I just thought the fact that the stadium was there was cool. I know the cops got to go in the stadium, which I did throughout the years. But I really enjoyed my time as a cop. I did the plainclothes thing, anti-crime, looking for guns. I did the street narcotics thing, which I did not enjoy as much. That's very dirty work. And in 2010, I was involved in a shootout. My partner and I were ambushed. We went to make an arrest during it was a home health aide being assaulted by her son, the son of the patient. And we were sent there, and he was basically waiting for us in an apartment. And when we went to lock him up, he started shooting at us, shot my partner multiple times. Myself and my partner and 2 other officers that arrived all returned fire. That person ultimately died of his wounds. My partner's fine. He's still working to this day. He's short a bunch of feet of intestines, and he's got a bit of a limp, but he's an absolute stud. So he's still charging along. But that was sort of like my into Detective Bureau. Now, I had already had paperwork in to go to Detective Bureau. At that point, I had 5 years on the job, and right around the 5-year mark is when you can start looking to make moves. So, anytime you get involved in a high-profile incident where things go right, because we all know they can go terribly wrong, they kind of ask you, what is it you want to do? And I said, well, I already have an application to Detective Bureau, so that's what I'd like to do. And within a short period of time, after they gave me, after I was clear, we're all clear from the shooting. Obviously, he shot at us first. But I ended up in the Detective Bureau in March of 2011. I transitioned from the 44th precinct to the 47th precinct detective squad, and I loved it. I loved doing robberies and burglaries. I loved chasing video. I loved doing interviews. I loved honing my interrogation skills. So the Detective Bureau kind of splits into two in any given precinct. You have the BRAM, which is the burglary, robbery, and apprehension module. And then you have the squad that covers everything. Missing persons, domestic cases, stolen rims off cars, like everything. Every crime you can imagine the squad handles. And you kind of progress from robberies and burglaries to the squad because the squad is easier. Robberies and burglaries are typically more labor intensive. And I actually wanted to stay doing robberies and burglaries because to me, I was in the interview room every single week, sometimes 2-3 times. I was doing lineups. I was constantly testifying. And I didn't want to do missing persons and do like boyfriend-girlfriend drama. Not that all those things aren't important. We know that they are. But I really liked doing that work. And I was actually able to start working homicide cases while I was in the BRAM still, which typically BRAM doesn't work on homicides directly. You get to assist. When you get to the squad, you can work homicides. I actually started catching homicides while I was in the BRAM. My first homicide case I caught was while I was still in the BRAM. And we ended up making an arrest on that after a while. But there was one particular case where a woman by the name of Doone Jacobs was murdered. And she had no criminal history. She was a decent human being by all accounts, walking on the street, executed from behind. And anytime you get a legitimately innocent victim, the pressure goes way up. The scrutiny from, the pressure from up top, the pressure on on yourself. The news media tends to cover these more. And this is one of those situations. Well, lo and behold, they make an arrest on a print hit on the getaway car that they'd recovered. And I walked into the 4 to 12, and the guy had been in the box for 8 hours, and 2 very seasoned detectives were like, he's not giving it up. He's not saying anything. It's a lost cause. And I just said, can I give it a shot? Can I try? And of course, I got laughed at, and I was told to stay in my lane and worry about my robberies and my burglaries. But my boss, who was always a big fan of mine, Lieutenant Fitz, was like, no, absolutely. Go in there, give it a shot. These guys couldn't do it in 8 hours. And I walked in and I sat down. I'll never forget. His name was Devin Jenkins. And we talked about everything and anything for the first half hour. And then I just went into the case, and he had sort of drawn a hard line that, he had driven a car, but he wasn't in it when the murder happened. And I spun a tale because, as we all know, the police can lie. And I spun a tale, and I basically suggested that, we had done cell phone work, and we knew that at the time the shots were fired, we knew all phones that were in that vicinity. We knew his phone was in the vicinity at the time that the shots were fired because we matched it up with the 911 call. That was all nonsense. But he bought it, and he broke, and he gave it to me, and he identified the shooter, who was someone that was known to me from a previous robbery case, and he identified the front seat passenger. So I didn't tell anyone. I had him write it all out on 2 pieces of legal paper, and I walked out, and I closed the door. I walked right past those 2 detectives. I might have rustled the papers as I passed them. I went right to the boss's office, and I'm like, I got it. It's Devin Jenkins, it's Fabian Koch, it's Brenda Brown. And the boss from Homicide was sitting there. The chief of the Bronx detectives was sitting there, and everyone stood up because it was a high pressure case. That's why the boss from Homicide there. That's why the chief of detectives is there. And I do believe that is what got me into Homicide, because about a week later, this enormous 6'6" detective, the guy who brought me into Homicide approached me. He's like, hey, what do you think about coming to Homicide? And I said, yeah, it's great. As soon as I get some more experience, I'd love to. That's part of my goals. I was like, I just don't have enough time yet. He's like, that's not for you to decide, kid. That's for us to decide. So do you want to come? I said, yeah. And with 4 years in Detective Bureau and 10 years on the job, I ended up in Bronx Homicide. In 2015, the guys in Homicide had 25, 30, 40 years on the job. And, I show up with 10 years. Most guys have been in homicide for twice that, some of them, so it was a bit of a transition. I definitely got yelled at a few times for things that weren't my fault. But I realized the gravity of the situation and the fact that I was so lucky to be there and work on those cases with my time and experience. And that begun my 10-year ride in homicide.
So as you heard him say, he went from investigating robberies and burglaries over to the homicide unit. And I wanted to know what that transition was like, what the learning curve was, and if he ended up having a preference for different types of investigations.
So both cases are approached the same, right? Like your typical robbery perp is not sticking around, so you're kind of left with your evidence, which a lot of times it's video surveillance, it's witness statements, it's tracing stolen property. Maybe you're doing phone work and you're doing Apple stuff to see where the iPhone ended up. Working homicides is not that much different. Like the framework of working a stranger robbery to a stranger murder is pretty much the same, right? There's not the path has already kind of been forged, and there's not a lot of wiggle room, I think. And what differentiates like a good detective from a great detective is finding those like side paths to sort of figure cases out, which I personally felt was like my specialty. It was like figuring out a way, And I'll give you a brief example. We had a case where someone was using a cell phone calling cab drivers, and then they were robbing them. We had the same number come up, but obviously prepaid came back to no one, and they weren't making any other calls, so you couldn't do phone work to figure out whose phone it was. So I was like, at the third cab robbery, I just called the number, and I pretended to be a customer service rep from Boost Mobile, saying, hey, we've got some service outages. We're so sorry. Hey, we also want to offer you a brand new iPhone, 7, whatever it was at the time. And, the kid was like, yeah, no, that's great. I'm like, just give me your name and address and we'll send it right over. And he gave it to me. And of course, I recognized the name immediately, but of course, I'm making the photo array while he's talking on the phone so I can rush over to the cab drivers. That's like thinking outside the box. And I think that's stuff that sort of differentiates good from great. And I think stuff that sort of highlighted my path and allowed me to make the jump to homicide with 10 years on the job. But, the biggest difference is the homicides are high pressure. Everyone is paying attention to your case. The days of the paper folder with the typed DD5s, as we call them, or investigative entries, are over. Everything you do, someone from your first line boss to the commissioner of the NYPD can at any time look at your progress and see where you're at. So you have to be on top of your case. You have to be moving in a direction of success. And if you're not, people are going to know, and they're going to call you out. They're going to call your boss out.
He touched on something there that I wanted him to expand upon, because as we know, like with any job, not all detectives are created equal and they don't all work the same way. So in his opinion, I wanted to know, what are those key ingredients that make a great detective, that make you stand out as the best of the best?
Yeah. I mean, it's like I tell my kids all the time, like no one's going to beg you to be great, right? People will tell you got to meet the standard. Any given job, they want you, here's your standards, they want you to meet it. No one's going to beg you to be great. You have to decide that. And I think policing is much the same, because like I said, no one is going to tell me, hey, call our subject on the subject phone and pretend to be T-Mobile. It's thinking outside the box. It's that insatiable curiosity to understand, to know, to leave no stone unturned. I mean, murder is like the pinnacle of police investigations, right? I think it's reserved for the best, and then I would even say to do cold case in a lot of aspects is even higher than the pinnacle, whatever that is. Listen, there's a path to this stuff. It's square peg, square hole. Here's the steps. Do your basic dozen investigative steps. And a lot of times, you're going to come up with cases where you've done your basic steps. You've done your crime scene's been worked. You've canvassed your video, your witnesses. And now what? You have nothing. How are you going to figure this out? Are you going to look for cooperators? Are you going to look for people in the area dealing drugs who get arrested and facing substantial time? We're going to flip them. It's all about your resource. It's all about your effort. And look, policing is a civil service job. right? And there's a lot of people that just show up and collect a check. It is what it is. It's not, we're not telling any secrets here, but there's a lot of people who are just meeting the standard. And, I don't think meeting the standard cuts it, personally, in any aspect of life, especially when some family member is lost their loved one and they are literally waiting to hear from you.
I couldn't agree with him more there. Now, I wanted to back up and ask him a follow-up question to something he said, because he mentioned about getting creative, trying to flip witnesses, things like that. And I wanted to know, how does he vet out that a person is actually legitimate and credible, and not just feeding him random information to further their own cause?
Sure. So, any source of information, like even a legitimate witness on the street. I've had cases where someone presents themselves as a witness and they give you information which completely sends the investigation in one way, and they were either completely wrong or they were doing it on purpose to try to thwart the efforts. But any information that comes in needs to be tested and vetted. Like, a lot of times you have to see what these people have to lose or what they have to gain, right? Someone who's facing a murder charge, or maybe even any significant case that wants to provide you information, they realize that information, if false, is not only not going to help them, it could hurt them. So a lot of times when people have a lot to lose, you tend to trust their information a little bit more than someone who's just like a CI who likes to call in and give information on cases, which we have a lot of that as well. But you still have to, you take it at face value, and you got to work it up, and a lot of times that's specific questions. Okay, this is what this is what you're saying you saw. Tell me about the elements that maybe the average person's not thinking to be creative about, like which direction people were headed, what were they driving, what were they wearing, specifics that someone who did not have that firsthand perspective wouldn't know.
Detective Klein told me that when he was working cold cases, sometimes he would open up a file and see that there was a really strong suspect in the case, and they may even be named right there towards the front of the file. And then, of course, there's cases with almost no leads. And I wanted to know, how did he work those cases differently, and what was that approach like?
So I'm going to go ahead and speculate that for those particular cases, they had a name, but they didn't have viable witnesses. And any homicide detective will tell you that the biggest hurdle in any given case is to convince people to tell you what they saw, and then to become, a witness to those things. If there's a name that had been sort of determined early on, you either didn't have witnesses, weren't aware of them, or they were uncooperative. One thing I did learn is that time does sort of heal, or does sort of lay those fears of testifying, as does distance. When you're working cold cases and you're trying to find all your witnesses, your CIs, your PO, your persons of interest, everything, no one's on the block anymore. I can't tell you how many times I travel. Once a month I would travel to Kissimmee, Florida, Orlando, Florida, and Atlanta, Georgia. Like those three cities, like Kissimmee and Orlando are the same, but everyone ended up down there that was in the Bronx in the 80s and 90s. And, I would be sitting at kitchen tables in Atlanta, Georgia, and people would be like, yeah, I knew back then, but I wasn't going to say anything. Here's the deal now. And I think people, when they separate themselves from the environment, they feel more comfortable telling you what they saw. And, if you did have a name early on, that could have helped. But also, like, technology has been a major factor. I had a particular case that I worked, the early 2016 case was a man shot right next to the old Yankee Stadium, and all over the case, Tito is the shooter. Tito. I'm like, all right, well, who's Tito? They never figured out who Tito was. But in a little note scrawled in a book, it said Tito lived at 757 Girard and he had 3 brothers. That's super easy. In today's modern technology, you just throw in the address, you're going to get everything, every domestic incident report, everything that ever was generated is now going to be right there at your fingertips. It took me 10 minutes to figure out who Tito was. I opened this case and boom, there's Tito. Now, all right, now we have to go find witnesses. And of course, I traveled to Orlando, Florida, where I found a witness. I traveled to Dominican Republic. I found another witness, and we were able to put a case together based solely on witnesses. But technology was all you needed. You needed something to crunch info and sort of collate it so you could look at it easily. Whereas they didn't have that back then. They didn't have video cameras in every corner, plate readers, cell phones, social media. Let us never forget how beneficial social media is to the solving of murders.
A simpler time, true crime. I'm telling you, that's my podcast.
I've had a case where a guy cut his he committed a murder, cut his family off, got rid of his bank account, dropped his cell phone, but you know what he kept? That Instagram account.
Hard to break up with the gram, Rob. It's hard.
I literally did a trap and trace warrant on his Instagram, and I was getting his IP addresses by the minute. And of course, we flew down to Miami and arrested him.
So as you heard, Detective Klein discussed how distance and time sometimes motivates witnesses to come forward, and that can cause breaks in cold cases. But I wanted to switch over to the technology and forensic side of things and ask him what he thinks has made the biggest difference, what has been a game changer, where the future lies, and where there are still limitations.
Really, the best advancement is the amount of DNA you need to develop a male donor. Forever, there was these cases where you might have had trace male donor A, not enough to develop a profile, and they're able to develop a profile from that now. And that held really true as far as like fingernails. And when you had a mixture of DNA and being able to isolate both victim and male donor 1, 2, 3. That's the single best, I think, advancement. I'm definitely not the scientist of the family. My wife is the deputy chief of forensic science for Bronx County DA's office. She's the DNA expert of this little operation. But even in her work, the stuff that deals with the familial and the genetic genealogy and the advancements there have unlocked unlimited potential as far as finding suspects. We had a case in the Bronx last year where a girl in the 90s, very young girl, I believe she was 13, Minerly Soriano, who was sexually abused and murdered and wrapped up in a rug and deposited in a dumpster in the Bronx. And they were able to use familial DNA to create a profile, and they were able to basically demonstrate the family tree of the suspect and say, well, we know it's not this guy because he was a kid when this guy was away in the army. So boom, it must be this guy. And then they were able to surreptitiously obtain his DNA. Lo and behold, you have a match. And they just actually got a conviction on that case recently. So yeah, that advancement alone is, now if I commit a crime and my DNA is not in a local database, it's not in CODIS, you can compare it all day. You're never going to get a hit unless I get swapped. But if you're able to do a workup on familial DNA, or even if you branch into genetic genealogy and you can determine my family tree, or you can develop a DNA relative, you can start narrowing it down real quick, and then you get your list of people, and then you send your undercovers out, and they're tailing those people, looking for abandonment or looking for the old tossed straw. So that is, I think, the future. We continue to build on that. What's scary, though, is like the defense bar, especially in the state of New York, is very strong. And for every advancement, they work to undermine it, and they'll throw everything at the wall to see what sticks, to limit your ability to use that type of stuff. Where's it going to go next? It's where the science goes. And I imagine even a smaller amount of trace DNA is going to eventually develop a profile.
Earlier in this episode, you heard from Detective Klein about how he was able to secure a confession from somebody who had refused to give one for 8 hours to anybody else. He is well known for his interrogation skills. Just ask Gregory Fleetwood.
I need to consider something for 1 second. I understand that things happen sometimes that we don't intend to. All right, I understand that. Everyone understands that. What people will not understand, Gregory, is if you're saying this female never had her hands on me and my DNA is present under her fingers.
I don't know what to tell you about that.
All right, so then answer me this.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you the most unlucky person in the world? I want you to consider something. In Davidson Avenue, in a one-block area, there are 3 separate people who have either been raped or strangled by you.
Hopefully, as one of my listeners, you don't ever have to find yourself on the other side of the interrogation table from him. But if you do, I would not recommend trying to pull one over on him.
Them right here, and then you went and got into the car that they came in. Then they came out with his shit, and they got into the same car. So stop talking to me like I got a flower pot for a head, because you don't understand how serious this is. You're bullshitting me, dear. You're going to go to jail if you're not honest. You realize you are going to take a murder charge. Forget about your high school. Forget about college. Forget about being a vet. Okay? You can clean dishes in a prison cafeteria. If you don't tell me everything, you are fucked.
From my understanding, she took his advice and gave him the information he needed to know. What I wanted to know from him was on a high level how he approaches interrogations. How does he ensure he is not interrogating people in a way that would elicit a false confession or anything that would be problematic? How can he be both ethical but also effective?
Yep. So, I mean, so having gone through countless trials and pre-trial hearings, they're always going to try to get rid of your statement, right? And it's always the same accusations. You kept the room cold. You didn't let him use the bathroom. You let him starve. You were mean to him. The police beat it out of him. So what I always did to start every single interview was to knock all that stuff out and to humanize this person who may have just done a terrible thing. Imagine trying to humanize a mother that just shook her own baby to death, right? Like if you have children, it's incomprehensible. But
Right.
If you have an objective, you have to put that aside and you have to talk kindly to someone who just killed their own child. But for me, I would not jump right into Miranda. You're allowed to do rapport building. You're allowed to get pedigree information. I would have a very quiet and kind conversation where I'd be like, are you okay? Do you need anything? Do you need to use the bathroom? Yes. Okay. On camera. Let's go use the bathroom. Come back. Are you cold? Because sometimes it's cold in here. Are you hungry? I would always ask it. And more often than not, they would say yes. And you better buy whatever they say they wanted and keep the receipt and put it in the case because it'll come up, and this was how I went about every interview. And I know it drove some defense attorneys nuts because I took their whole playbook. I'd always ask, hey, you've been treated well since you've been here, right? People have been nice to you? Yeah, the guy that picked me up was a bit of a jerk, but since I got here, you guys have been great. Thanks. Appreciate it. We try real hard to keep our customers happy. But just approaching that, even that process puts people at ease because I think their expectation is you're going to come in and be like, hey, have a seat. You have the right to remain silent. My very first cold case that I worked, I teamed up with an extremely senior detective from that particular precinct. And I certainly, with my 10 years on the job, was not going to tell him how, I develop a framework for our interview approach. So I just walked in with him and we sat down and he broke out the Miranda card. This is a guy with 30 years on the job and said, you have the right to remain silent. And I'm like, what? Hi, how are you? What's your name? Where do you live? Do you have kids? What are their names? Oh, I have a son as well. We have that in common. We both have kids. Which another thing that I do, I always get them to say their kids' names if they have children, and I write them down because I'm always going to revisit those names about an hour later when they're not saying what I need them to say. My approach to interviews, first and foremost, is to be kind and to humanize them because a lot of times they're not folks that do murders are often not expecting to be dealt with in a humanistic way. Right. And I'm not talking about perp hugging or anything like that. I'm talking about you have an objective. You want to motivate this person to say what you need them to say. Let's start off from a place of kindness and let's build to what go where we need to go. And, as far as the approach into getting into the culpable statement of the meat and potatoes, so to speak, it really depends on who's in front of you and what type of case you're dealing with. If you have trace evidence that is indisputable, that they are present or touch this item, gun, person, doorknob, safe, you can approach that interview differently, right? You can say, hey, have you ever been at this location? No, I've never been there in my life. Oh, you've never been there? So you've never been inside there? You've never worked there? You never did a job there? No, never. Okay. All right. Well, so this is, that's a problem. And this is in contrast to what I'm seeing on paper. So maybe you can explain that, but a lot of times it can be appeal to reason, you have people that will deny being on scene for something. And I like to call it truth on the installment plan. And if I had like $10 for every time I said that in a pre-trial hearing for a Huntley hearing, truth on the installment plan, and then, I would have to explain, truth on the installment plan. You go from I wasn't there to, okay, I was there, but I didn't do anything. Oh, I held his legs while they stabbed him, but I didn't stab him. And then finally you get to, I stabbed him, but I didn't stab him in the chest. I only stabbed him in the leg, and you do that by, once that person gives you a little bit, you don't jump all over it. You just sort of build around it. All right, so you were there. There's a reason you told me you weren't there. What was that? Oh, because you think I did something wrong. Okay, well, what if I told you that multiple people that were there saw you do this? And what if I told you that there was trace evidence that demonstrated you did this? Now you, who's a very nice guy sitting in front of me with a lot going on in his life that's positive, who's got these two kids, say their names, explain to me now how what you're telling me doesn't line up with the evidence, because the average person is going to look at that as deception, and deception is evil. Is that what's going on, or is there another explanation? Always offer the possibility of another explanation. And a lot of times when you get people thinking, you can literally see that internal cost benefit analysis going on. We're like, oh boy, I didn't think of that. Oh boy, he's right. I'm telling him I wasn't there. I didn't even think they had my cell phone records. I didn't even think that they might have someone from my crew that's cooperating. I didn't even think about fingerprints. And a lot of times it was like, hey, you've watched CSI, right? You've watched Law and Order. You know about DNA and fingerprints and all that stuff, right? You know about that stuff? Okay, well, we'll talk about that later. Why I'm asking, and you just get the wheels turning, and then it's the appeal to reason. Oh man, what if they have it and he's right? I'm lying about something he can prove. That makes me look guilty. So let me start fixing it. And by fixing it, we start making those installment payments to truth on the installment plan. But, I like to say that, a particular course or class or something helps me do it. It was literally just learning how to interact with people, learning what motivates them, what triggers them. For some people, it's triggering emotion. We had a kid that was robbing and shooting people all over the city. It was the most hotly followed pattern for the NYPD brass. And we finally had a suspect. And same thing, someone tried, they couldn't. I went in there. And for 10 minutes, I talked to the kid about the fact that his father wasn't in his life, which is sad. But I got him sobbing. And when he was broken down, I started building him back up. Hey, listen, I know if you would have had a father, you wouldn't have made these choices. I know if you would, I can tell you're a good kid. I know what I see in front of me, and who did this is not the person that you want to be. But to start on the right path is the truth. That's the start. So tell me what you did, and we'll work to make it better. And just talking to people like that, like something in their brain would fire, and they'd be like, all right, you know what? There is a benefit, whether it be moral or legal or what, to like giving a little bit, and you just keep chipping away towards the truth. I personally have never, that I'm aware of, had a false confession, but there was always also a lot of ancillary evidence that demonstrated these people. The more evidence you have, the harder you can approach it.
Confessions and interrogations are a tricky topic that get debated a lot in the true crime space. And it's understandable because there is a long history of false confessions and problematic interrogation techniques. So I found it helpful from him to hear how he was greatly reducing that risk while also being effective in securing confessions in cases where the victims' families are counting on him. Now, just a while ago, we talked about cases where there's oftentimes a very clear prime suspect, but not enough to go to trial. And because I cover older unsolved cases on the podcast, sometimes these cases are 30, 40, 50 years old. And people will comment and say, how come they don't just try? Why not shoot your shot? This suspect is aging, and there's a good chance that if not now, then never. So even as a detective, not being the person who makes that decision, I did want to get some insight from him about why that is.
Sure. So any given murder case it's not it's not something that exists just in a police department. It's not something that exists just in a particular detective squad. It's something that is being coordinated through the district attorney as well. You're not making a murder arrest unless you already have your DA's office on board. And I can tell you there are no shortage of times where you think you have enough, and then the DA's office is telling you, well, technically, they're always foreseeing they're trying to game plan what the defense is going to be. What they're going to provide is like an affirmative defense, or what they're going to try to develop as alibi. A lot of times there's a disconnect there because we're like, we have enough, let's go. And they'll be like, no, you need more. And the other thing is, once you bring that person in, your interview is going to be, you have one shot. It's do or die. And if that person invokes, you're never getting another shot to interview them. They've invoked on that case. And when you bring someone in to interview them, listen, sometimes it makes sense because there's nothing else. Well, he's a person of interest. Let's see what he says. Let's start working on his alibi so we can start working to undermine it. And you can do what's a non-custodial interview. The only thing is, in states like New York, there's no such thing as a non-custodial interrogation. Miranda applies when you have custody and interrogation. Miranda applies when I'm bringing you into the squad, the precinct, and say, you are not free to leave. I'm going to be talking to you. I'm going to ask you accusatory questions. I'm going to be asking you to formulate, discuss your alibi. Tell me, I'm going to ask you directed, pointed, accusatory questions. Miranda applies. Now, legally, if I bring you in to ask you, about a case, even if I'm asking questions that sort of veer into accusatory, if you're not in custody, I technically don't have to advise Miranda. That switches when a reasonable person believes they're no longer free to leave. And I can tell you what the Bronx says is the minute they start making culpable statements, that is going to kick in, and the reasonable person's no longer going to feel that they're free to leave. Now, I have, in my burglary robbery days, to get around that, I would stop my POIs on the street. I'd be like, let me ask you about this. There was a burglary at this building over here. What were you doing at the Coinstar with $500 in change? You want to talk about that? Because $500 in change is missing from this guy's house. And they'd be like, yeah, man, I was desperate. I screwed up. And I would let them talk. And I'd be like, all right, sounds good. And just to double down, I would lock them up the next day just to prove that they weren't in custody. I have had successful interviews that turned into interrogations that weren't necessarily in custody. But all that stuff's going to get litigated. And the majority of the time, the DA's office doesn't want to litigate things if they don't have to, right? They want their statement to be protected. So I think that's, I completely understand the frustration. I've had plenty of cases where I'm like, we have enough. It's rarely going to be the police. It's most often going to be the attorneys in charge of prosecuting these cases that are like, we don't have it yet, or there's too much exculpatory evidence. There's too much, Brady material demonstrating that the person might not have done it. And they have to consider how the case is going to be presented to a grand jury and a jury. And, we're like 1 + 1 = 2 type people. We want it. We want it. We've got it. Let us go try to get the statement. But, the minute you ring that bell and the minute they invoke, it's done.
So then in that scenario, what comes next?
Most of the time the DA's office are going to tell you, look, you're close. This is what you need. Okay. I need another witness. Get me another witness. And it's kind of like, what kind of case am I looking at? I always in the 47th, we would have these large scale barbecues where there'd be 50, 100 people in them, and someone would get shot and killed. And I'd be like, that's the barbecue clause. 6 months from now, one of the people in the barbecue is going to get pinched with a gun, and they're going to be like, I'll tell you who shot the guy on 232 in the barbecue in July. And you're like, and without fail, they would always come together, but maybe you've got trace evidence in the form of biological material, DNA, fingerprints. You have to be able to foresee that that person can explain away that trace evidence and make it sound reasonable. And I think that's one of the elements of the Porter case that I was facing during that interview. But you have to be very careful that your evidence that points to guilt, isn't undermined by a crafty defendant, and that can happen. So you kind of want as much as you can get to paint a picture of guilt, right? And I always say there's no good or bad evidence. There's just evidence. And if it paints a picture of culpability, then you have a case. But you don't get to ignore your bad evidence. You don't get to select your evidence. It is what it is. I mean, that's how cases get undone. You can't leave anything out. You can't leave the bad witness statement out. You can't leave the jailhouse snitch that's giving you another story. All that has to become part of the picture.
I appreciate everything he said there, just because it goes back to, again, what we were talking about before with the confessions. He is not ignoring evidence and only cherry picking evidence that supports what he believes. He's looking at everything objectively and making sure he has a sound case. Next, a lot of my listener questions had to do with task forces and multidisciplinary teams and how they all interact together to solve homicide cases. So I asked Detective Klein how he would speak to all of that, including how various expertise and different teams get brought to the table, who takes the lead, what it's like working in those situations, all of it. And an example I gave was a homicide investigation where there's also clearly arson.
Sure. So the lead is obviously going to be the precinct detective and the homicide detective. Depending who you ask, it might be the precinct detective. And I think if you ask any given homicide detective, he's going to say he or she's the lead. But in a perfect world, it's a dual threat approach where two people are working as partners to work the case. Now, any given homicide is typically all hands on deck, right? So anyone who's working is going out on the field day one, maybe even day two. And then as the days sort of tick by, it narrows down to maybe just the homicide detective and the precinct detective. That being said, day one, obviously you have your crime scene unit out there. They're their own entity. You have your forensic investigation division folks, the NYPD lab. Obviously, you have the medical examiner people who are also obtaining forensic evidence through the autopsy process and the processing of fingernails and any other trace evidence that, becomes an artifact on the body. And yeah, I mean, listen, an arson case, obviously, you're going to bring in the NYPD does have an arson and explosion squad that is always going to be involved. The fire marshal also has their own investigators that do have arrest powers actually as investigators. Really, if it's a homicide case, it's whoever is needed. I mean, the NYPD has over 30,000 people. It's like an army, and depends on what type of case is in front of you to determine what personnel you're bringing in. If you have some high-end video type stuff where maybe your average investigator's having trouble, we have a unit who is our technical response team. The NYPD has a scuba unit. They have people that go into the water and look for evidence. Really, when it comes to a homicide, anyone who's needed is coming out there without question.
So in an organization as huge as the NYPD, I wanted to know one specialized team that the general public may not even know exists.
Yeah, there is a unit called the telephony unit, and it is a bunch of specialists who are experts at phone records. You can give them your phone records and they are going to, figure out all sorts of stuff. They got all the latest programs to sort of collate and organize phone records. They're going to be processing your cell sites. If you have, let's say you have cell phone records with geographical data, and you need that to be sort of put into a PIN map. I tended to do that myself because I didn't want to wait for the request. But it's like a painstaking process. First, you got to figure out the standard time, UTC time, and the time the phone records are. And then you have to, sometimes you have to plot based on like the geographic data on a map, and all you have is like Latin longe, and you're like trying to figure out where exactly you are, and if you're off, it can make a huge difference in a case. So I don't recommend it. I tended to do it myself the majority of the time, and then I would also send it out and see if it came back the same. But I think that's an interesting one that was probably underused. We have a bunch of task forces of both state, federal, local PD people. As you know, Megan, I was part of the cold case, the FBI cold case task force Reaper. and we jointly worked cold cases with the benefit of the feds, which is we can go on about that. But yeah, there's so many secret squirrel units that you're like, what you do? What? How did you get there? Who do you know? All right, well, what can you do for me? We have an NYPD beekeeper, which people, anytime there's like a swarm of bees, he shows up and collects all the bees and moves them to a safe bee destination.
I was really proud of myself for the restraint I showed in not asking the 50 follow-up questions I had about being the NYPD beekeeper. Instead, we kept the conversation going about task forces.
As you know, like the state and the feds have different laws, right? And I'll just say it plainly: the federal laws and the sentencing guidelines for federal crimes is much more severe, right? I mean, I think New York State has taken on a holistic approach towards sentencing and crime and punishment, whereas the feds still drop the hammer on you. So a lot of times where you see the benefit in a federal task force such as Task Force Reaper was people tend to talk more if they feel like there is some federal involvement. Now, through the course of being part of this task force, we were deputized as federal agents. And the benefit to that is when you're interviewing someone, now, as a state detective, if you lie to me, there's no fallout from that. But when you're lying to a federal agent, it becomes a federal crime. So people were super hesitant it's not without fail, but people typically are super hesitant to make a full statement to a federal agent, knowing that, there could be something on the back end. The biggest benefit that I saw was that your pathway to legal process, like subpoenas, search warrants, is much easier. People will probably be surprised to know that it is not easy to get a search warrant in Bronx County. It just isn't. They're very hard to write to a standard that these judges like. And then when it comes time to swear out a search warrant, you basically have to go sit in court and wait for a judge to call on you, and he has no interest. Typically, he or she has no interest in calling on you because they just want to get through their arraignment or their criminal court appearance or whatever. So it's unfortunate, but that's the way it is, and that's the way it's been for years. I don't think that's ever going to get fixed. But when you're looking to obtain a federal search warrant, you're literally the federal prosecutor writes it up, and it's all done over typically Teams, or it's scheduled in the courtroom, and you get it done very quickly. That's one of the main benefits. It's just the pathway to legal process is very quick. The other way is the weight of the federal system. People realize that once they're facing the potential of a federal crime and federal sentencing, they just tend to talk more. And if you are under some sort of federal investigation, the majority of people in the Fed that are under a federal investigation ultimately cooperate. So even if you have a target of a homicide, right, and let's say you have a witness who's uncooperative, and you basically mark that witness as a person of interest in that they have firsthand knowledge of a homicide, a lot of times you're waiting for that witness to make a mistake, right? And it could take weeks, months, years, but the minute they do, and let's say they get a gun and they've got prior felony convictions, well, congratulations, sir. You just got yourself trigger locked. You're being prosecuted federally. But we would love to talk about that murder that happened 2 years ago. And I would say 9 out of 10 times, the guy who's facing 7 years, who's used to a revolving door in the state, is going to talk and tell you what you need. So, I mean, that's just one example. But as far as Task Force Reaper, I think we successfully, during the time frame, closed 4 cold cases. We traveled the country working together. I mean, there was a great bunch of FBI agents that I became very close with. I'm still close. I still talk to them. We have sentencing coming up on one particular case that we closed together. But they just have a lot of resources, and they are able to get information that maybe you can't, right? Like, for instance, they can take a phone number and say, check this phone number through every single federal database, see if it ever came up on a wire or, like a wiretap, see if it's involved in any sort of narcotic angles. And a lot of times you can attribute an identity to a number that way, or you can attribute criminal activity or other investigations, which may help yours. So, I mean, the possibilities are really endless. But the NYPD has a task force for everything. They have an ATF task force. They have an organized crime task force. There is obviously no shortage of gang violence task force, safe streets. It's always a good spot to sort of expand your experience and your reach as far as like an investigator.
I found it so interesting to hear how a huge organization like the NYPD interacts within its own organization as well as its interface with external parties. Shifting gears a bit, I wanted to know more about his cold case detective work and when he was working homicides, how many were active homicides, how many were cold cases, what that typically was like for detectives in NYPD, if they were only working one type at a time. You get the picture. Also, I had a question from Jules Thorpe, who is the host of Missing in Hushtown podcast, as well as your host, Jules, and she wondered what a typical amount of cases he would have at a time.
Yeah, so each precinct has its own detective squad, and there are, like 50 precincts, and I don't even know how many there are in the city. I was always in the Bronx my entire career. But each precinct has their own detective squad. Then each borough has their own homicide squad, right? So, and some boroughs have two, like Brooklyn North, Brooklyn South, Queens North, Queens South. The way it works is when a homicide happens, a detective from that particular precinct of occurrence and the homicide squad work it as partners. The cold case squad is a separate entity. I'll be honest with you, I never really dealt with them that much. I definitely gave them some information throughout the years that solved their cases. I have a funny story about that, but I didn't spend a lot of time working with them. When I got to homicide, one of my mentors, Malcolm Ryman, who's done a lot of serial killer work, he told me, the boss really likes when you have projects, and he really likes when you pick up cases. I ended up picking up a case early on, which ended up closing, but that was like beginning of 2016, and that's what sparked my interest in working cold cases. I just loved the mystery of it. I love dealing with, witnesses scattered across the country and traveling and finding them and working it up and the excitement of it coming together. In 2020, I ended up being assigned to a task force after a police officer was killed to specifically crush these two gangs that were operating this specific project. And for all of 2020, I was hid away in a warehouse on the Bronx border within a room with no windows, in a dirty building. And all we did was just crush this one particular project. Every shooting went federal, every gun case went federal, and we were going to make these gang members pay, basically. When I came back from that, I told my boss, I was like, look, I did this year, it was asked of me to be part of this unit. It was not fun for me. We did come up with a good product, and a lot of people went to jail, which was great. And we did honor the memory of that officer in that sense. But when I got back, I couldn't wait to get back to homicide. And when I did, my boss was like, thank you for doing that. What do you want to do? Do you want to do RICO cases? Do you want to do long terms? I was like, I just want to focus on cold cases. Like, that's what I want to do now. He's like, all right, that's your job. And I became the cold case guy in homicide. There was one that was before me, Malcolm Ryman. He had retired right around that time frame. So it was kind of like an easy not an easy seat to fill, but it was in a vacant seat. He had taught me a lot about how to approach these cases, and that was sort of just the transition into that. Any detective in any precinct can be like, you know what? I'm going to reinvestigate this 89 homicide. No one's going to be like, whoa, guy. There's so many cases that remain unsolved. I used to have this stack of these green ledgers that were next to my desk. I called it the Book of Lost Souls. And it was pre-digital. Every time a murder happened, whoever in homicide would write in date of occurrence, time, location, victim's name, MO, the method, gunshot, blunt force, sharp force. And when I would look back at the 80s and 90s from those books, if there was an arrest made on them in red ink on the right column, it would say A1 for one arrest, 2, 3, and so on. And there would be pages and pages of unsolved cases, just like names that had like families and like histories and that just lost souls in that book. And it always motivated me on those boring nights to like look through that. And I actually, when I solved the Porter case in 2022, no one had a red pen. I had to go to the dollar store and like find a red pen to like draw in the A1 in that column back from 96. So, I mean, as a squad detective, you could be catching cases every single day. When I was doing robberies and burglaries, the flow could have been, 3 in a day, but then the next week, maybe 2 or maybe 15. You could never predict really where it was going to go. In the progression to homicide, it sort of ebbs and flows with the weather. Obviously, during the summer, your case queue goes up. Around the holidays, we tend to have more violence. As far as numbers, I mean, in homicide, you want a lower case queue because it means you're closing your cases out. But when I was doing cold cases, I was keeping anywhere from 3 to 6 or 7 cases in my queue at a time. There were those ones that were just, I hate to use the word unsolvable, but just nothing was coming together, but you still held on hope, and they were like just permanently positioned in your queue. And then there's the ones that you run around on every single day. And then there's the ones that you're like, I'm going to get to this, but I don't want anyone else to touch it. But as soon as I'm done with this, I'm going to get to that. So it's something that ebbs and flows with time and what's happening.
Sierra from Unsolved Couple Podcast wanted to know, how does a cold case that has been kind of buried for a while, what makes it come to the forefront again when it does?
But there's really a multitude of ways. People calling. I can't tell you. I had a rule that I had sort of instituted with my little cold case team is if someone calls and says, my so-and-so was murdered back in 1989, I'd really like to know what happened or if anything else can be done, then you have to look into it. If we think back about that lost ledger of souls that existed next to my desk all those years, there were pages of people that had been forgotten, and at any given time, family members could have called and brought their names to the surface. So there's so much value in that, and just calling and saying, "Hey, what about this person?" I think that opened a lot of cases, at least 5 or 6 that I can think about right now. They're like fielding a phone call, like where someone was talking to someone and they discussed the case, and they're like, "Hey, this case was just discussed." I once had a gentleman, he had a street mechanic. He was actually a retired detective, had a street mechanic, and the street mechanic's like, "Hey, my friend got killed back." It was the 89 case with Tito. My friend got killed. Tito was the shooter. Everyone knew he did it, but nothing ever happened with it. So the retired detective called Bronx Homicide, and I answered the phone. And he was like, "Who do I talk to about an old case?" And I said, "Me? I'll take it. Talk to me about it." But and that resulted in a successful case. A lot of times when you're proffering people, especially in the federal system, and they're giving up the world, they'll start talking about old stuff. "Oh, this guy killed multiple people." I actually fielded a call from Boston Homicide in 2024, where they had a former roommate of one of Whitey Bulger's main assassins who was bragging about something. And the guy's like, he also killed a guy named, we'll say Joe, in 84. It was a very distinct name, but in 84, when they were doing a transaction about some sort of drug diluent or something. And I had to go and look in 84 and try to find every single case that had that first name from 84, where like it wasn't solved, where it might have been narco, might have been the MO, and that other agencies calling and saying we have this information. It's something that needs to be looked at. We have a potential. But yeah, I mean, that's.
Detective Klein mentioned people calling to check on old cases and bringing them to the surface again. So I wanted to know, what tips does he have for family members, particularly those navigating cold cases of their loved ones. What is the best way to interact with law enforcement and form a partnership to help work together in that scenario?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to offer that, but I'm also going to offer a recommendation to law enforcement. When I open a cold case, I would find a family member. Typically, I would find the closest family member. I would say, here is my cell phone number. Call me whenever you want an update. You're making these people, you're showing them that you care. You're giving them the access. That access is very rare for some reason, and I don't understand it. People will give their office number, their email. You know what? I'm taking on your case. I'm working now for your family. I'm accountable to you. And what that also does is it creates a stress. It creates a healthy stress where I'm saying, now I owe these people results. And on those boring nights when it's cold and rainy and you're doing the 4 to 12 and you could easily sit at your desk and watch, the latest episode of Landman and no one would mind. Or you could start digging into associates, find out who's in jail and make a plan to go start interviewing people. If you need a little bit more of a boost to be driven, that's it. And I have multiple family members. I'm not bragging right now, but I have multiple family members on the date of the death of their loved one. And these are closed cases, majority of them. Their birthday. I have a pregnant woman who was murdered and her baby was literally cut from her stomach. That's a story for another episode, but I still hear from that family that lost their daughter in that terrible way. I feel like you need to demonstrate to folks that you care. You need to demonstrate that you're accountable and that you're accessible. So from the perspective of family, would I recommend calling a detective every day demanding an update? Of course not. Then you become a pest. Whatever medium the detective gives you to contact them, and I would always ask for a phone number and with the promise that I'm not going to abuse you, I would do. If they're telling you they're actively working the case, I don't think there's anything wrong with checking in once or twice a month to see where we're at. And even when you're speaking to them, say, hey, is it okay if I follow up with you in 2 weeks to see how those interviews went? You're showing the detective, you're creating that healthy stress. You're demonstrating that they're accountable, which they should be. But you're also keeping that name, that case in the detective's mind. You need to be able to, any given detective's desk has a stack of folders. Some that get a little light on info flowing in tend to shift towards the bottom. If that's your family member, that the case should shift. You should do everything you can to get that case to be front and center on the conversation and the effort. Listen, this is what these people get paid for. To work those cases, you need to be great, and that's a subjective thing, I think. If you're being great, and if you're doing these people a service or a disservice. So yes, I think you should reach out and you should contact them. A lot of times you get families that are fractured and you get 5 people asking you for information. There should be one person. That person should develop a relationship with that detective.
As we begin to wrap up this episode, I wanted to share a few more listener questions that came up. And the first was, who was Detective Klein's professional mentor?
That would have to be my former boss, who was like a father figure to me, Lieutenant Sean O'Toole. He did over 40 years in the NYPD. He was in charge of Bronx Homicide from the late 90s up until a few years ago. And he was a guy, he was like a homicide encyclopedia. And you could walk into his office and be like, 1999, guy gets shot on Paulding Avenue. They thought, Ray did it. And he'd be like, oh, yeah. And he would tell you about it. His knowledge and his ability to motivate investigators is really something. But also a human element of life's tough right now. You've got a lot going on. He would notice that and he would talk to you and take care of you on an emotional level, which seems weird for tough homicide detectives to have to think about. But he's to this day I'm in touch with him. I talk to him all the time. He brought me to Homicide with 10 years on, and he really instilled in me that there's no such thing as a bad case. There's just a case that doesn't have a lead yet or doesn't have the break we need, and to be accountable to the families of victims. He didn't want to ever hear that a homicide detective wasn't in touch with the family. He didn't ever want to hear that someone didn't have the answers or didn't have the updates that they needed, and or that you weren't doing the right thing at the DA's office, that, perhaps someone was looking for you to show up over there and sign a warrant or something. If he got a call that you weren't doing the right thing, you heard about it. And he never directed you what to do. He suggested it, but in a way that that's exactly what you wanted to do. And he was just a great man, a great leader. Definitely my hero on the job as far as influence.
Working for an enormous department like the NYPD, he has seen just about everything. And so with that in mind, one listener wanted to know what safety tips he may have for somebody, either in a parent role, safety tips for their kids, or own personal safety tips, just based on the crimes he has seen play out.
I mean, people need to approach strangers with that suspicious radar at all times. I mean, the amount of people I've seen that have met folks through chance encounters, and those people end up causing them harm, either robbery or murder. I'm super suspicious of new people, not to an extent where I'm like manic about it, but like if I meet someone through, one of my children has a new boyfriend, like I'm like very suspicious. I want to know. I want to ask questions, especially for the parents of girls. I think it's extremely incumbent upon us to ask a lot of questions. Background: where's your dad? Where does he work? What does he do? The oversharing on social media, multiple murders that I've been involved in where people were highlighting their new gains, the old lotto winning, fanning out the money. Next thing you know, you're the victim of a home invasion. The Facebook marketplace meetups, multiple murders of people that were going to buy new Jordans or a motorcycle, and it's a setup. Basic security around your home. Think like the bad guy thinks. If I was the bad guy, how am I going to get into my house? Dark rear window. Windows should be secure. You should have a baseline security system. It's very cheap to have a security system and video. Those two things alone are going to deter most burglars. And just keep in mind, 99% of burglars are not like cat burglars dangling from the ceiling. They're usually drug addicted people who are desperate and they're looking for the easy target. As far as like property crimes and person on person, like I see and I've trained all my kids in this, when you leave someplace like a store, the mall, pay attention to who's paying attention to you. Because someone who plans on committing a crime is not playing it cool. They're waiting for their moment. And if you walk out and someone's paying attention to you, turn around and go right back in and find the guy that looks like he works for a living and say, could you walk me to my car? And 99 out of 100 times, I'm sure that person will say yes. Even my wife, who's a seasoned prosecutor, when things get hectic on the train downtown, she goes and stands next to the guy that works for a living, the construction guy, or the guy who, you don't stand next to the investment banker who's going to be a part of the, he's going to be part of the audience when bad things happen.
I mentioned in the intro of this episode that Detective Klein was on Netflix for the Son of Sam series. So I asked him a little bit about that and if he could talk about how that came about.
I am on Netflix. The Son of Sam tapes that came out this past summer, three-part series that covers sort of the origin story of David Berkowitz right up until the time he's arrested. And on the back end of that, episode 3, in about the last half hour or so, I am prominently featured. It was a fun experience to film that and to sit in an old bar in Brooklyn that was like straight out of the 1970s. It was really cool. But at any rate, 2024, I get contacted by a Son of Sam researcher / podcaster, YouTube personality by the name of Manny Grossman. Manny is very much into all aspects of the Son of Sam. He sort of progressed through the theories of the cult involvement to where he's arrived today, which is that Berkowitz is a lone shooter, which is also what I believe. So Manny and another retired detective from Yonkers were going through some old files pertaining to the Berkowitz case, and they found a sketch from April of 76, which was a doppelganger to David Berkowitz. Now, the first actual shooting that Berkowitz is responsible for occurred in July of 6. Now, it was a shooting of Donna Loria and Jody Valente. So the Son of Sam didn't exist in April. So they were able to figure out that particular sketch was associated to a case that where the victim, Wendy Savino, was shot in her car while she had just left the restaurant. Her husband had driven away in a separate car. A male comes up, shoots her multiple times through the glass, and then walks away. And she crawls into the restaurant. She ends up doing the sketch through the police department while she's in the hospital. And they, as soon as the first shooting happened in the Berkowitz pattern, they obviously compared the notes. You had a very similar MO. Your geographic location was very close to where many of the Berkowitz Son of Sam shootings were. And at that point, it was just comparing notes. But Wendy she was from England, and her husband was a Bronx politician, so to speak. And after the shooting, she was so afraid she went to hide out in England, and her kids were sent somewhere to live under assumed names. And not till the Berkowitz and Son of Sam shooting spree became center stage and the other sketches came out. And when he's finally arrested and he's on TV, Wendy sees him and she said, "Oh my God, that's the guy that shot me." She comes back to the U.S. At that point, he'd already admitted to his crimes and the case was for the most part adjudicated. And she just remained silent about this for many years. So we found Wendy, we interviewed her. She's a very believable and compelling victim. And she drew, you definitely could put that onto your page if you'd like, or on your Instagram page. People want to check it out. It's out there. It's in the news. So, after we interviewed Wendy, we did our best to reinvestigate the case. I went and re-interviewed David Berkowitz in jail, which, is, you could probably imagine, was a little more stressful than your average murder interview because you're interviewing one of the most notorious serial killers, the most notorious serial killer in New York history, and one of the top in U.S. history, I would say. From 76 to 77, that New York City was gripped in fear with the Son of Sam pattern. He denied the shooting, but he admitted that the sketch was a doppelganger. And when he was interviewed as a part of his initial pattern, he admitted to a shooting where he shot an older woman who he stated crawled away. Now, authorities were never able to figure out who that was. When I confronted him with that statement, and that was a statement that was stenoed in what statement he was doing actually to the district attorney's office. When I confronted him with that statement, he denied ever making it. So I don't know if old age has gotten to him or if he's, he was up for parole that week. I don't know if he thought it was against his penal interests to mention another shooting that he had not been charged with, thinking he could be charged with it. I don't know, and there's a possibility there's a doppelganger who was existing during that time who was randomly shooting women through cars. Probably less likely, but yeah. So obviously it's a felony assault because she's close to 90 years old. She's alive and well today. She's a wonderful woman. So we closed the case administratively with him as the perpetrator, which means he's not charged. It's not on his rap sheet, but the case is closed. And we say that we've developed probable cause based on her identification, which was valid, her sketch, the MO, the demographic location of the shooting, the geographic location of the shooting. And, all things combined and considered, there's more than probable cause to demonstrate that he was a shooter. So, yes, if anyone's interested, there is that.
Definitely go check it out. And also don't forget to subscribe to this podcast because I have a couple projects in the works with Detective Klein. I'm going to be doing an upcoming episode that revisits the Jasmine Porter case and get a lot more information from him that I really just didn't have access to when I first released the episode. In addition, one question I didn't ask, at least to put on here yet, was one that came from my podcast friend Kylie from Primetime Crime Pod. She wanted to know what case haunts him. And he doesn't have just one, but he did have a pretty quick answer: the unsolved murder of Solomon Robinson. So feel free to look up some information on that case, but know that there will be another episode forthcoming. I want to thank Detective Klein so much for taking the time to interview, to give us a little more background information on not only him, but his experiences and the questions a lot of us had about detective work. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts, and also recommend the podcast to a friend. Word of mouth has been great in helping me grow the podcast. This has been a bonus episode, but I will have another full-length episode out next Monday and every Monday thereafter. And as always, thank you so much for listening.